Okay. This documentation is definitely more on the imprecise side. This is an idea that I just captured, and it is not refined at all yet, but I thought it was good enough to be documented. How to cut to the chase real quick. This is my personal opinion. This is the way my mind is set up. So, on a scale of 1 to save the world in terms of importance, I would say this is 9. Okay. The reason being is because, speaking in terms of psychology, this is a way to use reason to repair whatever you want to call it. Malfunctioning brain activity, malfunctioning belief system stuff. So it's not necessarily a psychology. And also, of course, I'm not professional. I have no academic credentials whatsoever, so not advice. Okay. So, to the extent that psychological disorders can be reversed or normalized or repaired utilizing reason, to the extent that that is a possible thing, this idea is a 9 because it's basically broadly categorizing all things that can go wrong with thinking into 2 easy to understand causes or categories, subsets. Not necessarily that it's going to make things easier or faster, but it should. And that would be the test of the idea, which I'm not going to perform. But that would be the idea, the test of the idea. Finally, you have an idea, so you would test it, but obviously I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to record this thought, and people can throw it away or keep it as they wish. So it's a 9, in my opinion, in terms of the idea of psychology and the idea of repairing disorder with reason, to the extent that that is a possible thing at all. It's a 9 in those terms, but also when I think about epistemology, and I always have to mention that when I say epistemology, I'm always utilizing the idea of objectivist epistemology, and or you can just call it conceptual mechanics, because of different uses of the words. I think objectivist epistemology is focused on the concept itself, whereas mainstream, that's a bad word, but orthodox is a bad word too. Pre-established epistemology, I think mostly defines itself as having to do with knowledge and how we establish knowledge. All right, but you can get into how the 2 definitions of epistemology work together. I prefer the objectivist epistemology definition because I don't think that formal logic necessarily identifies or recognizes the concept of concepts in and of themselves. But anyways, I think it just deals with interactions. So anyways, there's a lot of overlap. And all right, so the thing is about conceptual mechanics, because that's what I'm going to most often refer to the field of study that I'm talking about. The thing about conceptual mechanics is what are the objectives of the science? What are the objectives of any science? The objective of mathematics is to produce mathematics. Better and better mathematics over time. the point of a field of study is not to stagnate and to only create lateral development, although lateral development is very valuable. But it is to improve over time. Good, better, best. So in the field of epistemology, which I would call conceptual mechanics, what is the point of that field? Well, it's going to improve your thinking. It's going to streamline and just... It's about thinking. It's about concepts. It's about the way your mind works. So the promise of the field, to me, is to improve your thinking. So conceptually speaking, when one concept affects the rest of the field of concepts, you would say that that's very fundamental. So in terms of the way the mind works, this idea seems very fundamental because it seems like you can extract its presence from almost all scenarios, which I won't spend a lot of time doing because I'm just trying to quickly, even though I do ramble, I'm just trying to quickly capture the concept. Okay. So the idea itself, it's going to be two methods of establishing belief or determining actions, which, in terms of conceptual mechanics, those would be, well, anyways. It's going to be these two ways of believing, and we're going to consider them separate and imagine that they cause conflict, and then we're going to consider them as working harmoniously together, and then it's going to fix everything, you know. Because I'm speaking quickly and because I'm speaking simply, I can speak that way. I assume that I can provide greater academic rigor at any moment, should I need to. All right, so the first belief or way of determining action, truth changes belief. Okay, so this is saying that truth is more fundamental than belief. So this would basically be another way of saying the scientific method. This would be another way of saying deduction, right? My favorite example, my favorite robust example of deduction is Euclid's geometry, where, you know, his axiom, you know, built all this stuff on top of it. So that's truth changes belief. And you can imagine the literal interpretations of the word. I don't know, if any sort of like superstition was passed down to you during your upbringing, while you were growing up, and then later on you decided that that didn't really make sense, so you stopped believing that belief, that would be an example of what I'm talking about. That's where basically, it's also what Aristotle was saying, like, the answers to all questions about this reality must come from this reality, right? It's the same idea as, it's another way of saying the same idea as, because we want to objectively understand this, we don't want to precisely define it and then be super prone to inconsistency, right? There's a difference between a concept that's right. Okay, so you have to identify a concept that is evolving and changes, and like the word everything. You know, think about the literal filler content of the word everything. Is it always incorporating more material? Yes, it is. And then, like, think about a contextually defined truth. So, like, do the right thing, okay? And then, while trying to study the sentence, do the right thing, you come across the saying, honesty is the best policy, right? Okay, good. You have more information about what you're trying to explain and utilize. Good, great. Now, that statement has exception, right? Honesty is the best policy, but it's not the best policy when a serial killer is asking you where your wife is, right? So in that situation, in that context, lying is the best thing to do, is the right thing to do. So doing the right thing, it was at first, we defined it as honesty is the best policy. And then later knowledge changed our, adapted our, made improvements to our definition of the phrase, do the right thing. Because when you're lying to the serial killer about where your wife is, you're still doing the right thing, right? So the concept adapted to be consistent to another situation. That's just a type of concept, right? That's just a type of concept, and it's a legitimate type of concept. In order to establish the legitimacy of that type of concept, because it can be thought of as being inconsistent, right? Because that's what I'm doing by trying to define an objectively defined concept. It's a goal, it's an effort to maintain this idea. But you can tell that it's a legitimate concept because it's an ability of the mind, right? One of the things I say about conceptual mechanics, as opposed to formal logic, is that as long as a concept is functional, that is a valid concept, right? Formal logic wouldn't identify something like that. So when you're trying to see the difference between formal logic and conceptual mechanics, formal logic would want that. Formal logic would be more in the overlap area where formal logic and epistemology meet. Formal logic would be more concerned with honing that concept and proclaiming that it is valid or invalid for these reasons or whatever. Right? And that's a good thing. But epistemologically speaking, or speaking in terms of conceptual mechanics, a concept is valid as soon as it's functional. As soon as you can draw conclusions from a concept, as soon as you can use it in context, as soon as you can make it interact successfully, consistently with other concepts, it's immediately a valid concept, right? So we have instances of concepts that were not valid in a formal logical sense, but they were perfectly valid in terms of epistemology. Take, for example, the old idea of the four elements of the universe: fire, wind, water, earth, whatever version of that you want. That is an invalid concept. It's not good enough. However, it is functional. People really used that for a while and actually drew conclusions from it. And some of those conclusions were good, and some of them weren't. And, it's part of the scientific method that error is included in the scientific method, because improving your concepts and improving your theory, that is the scientific method, improving, which implies that error has already been taken into account. Okay. So, truth changes belief. Okay. So, there's a lot of versions of saying that same thing, and I hope that I've been clear about that. I have to keep thinking that's for my own sake, because it's easier and faster to say that I've achieved clarity when I do that. And then when I think about somebody listening to this, I just have to say, like, you have to meet me halfway. You have to do some of the work. I can't take the time to literally jump inside the mind of somebody else and just, crank the mechanism until the concepts, emerge in their mind. And then they see what I'm saying and we understand each other and it's a big harmonious thing. I can't do that, so I have to trust that some of the work is going to be done by the person listening. And that was said to help me move forward more rapidly. Okay. All right, so I'm going to say that I've defined truth changes belief in an objective way, or in a goal-oriented way, or in an effort way, where you keep trying to understand what that means. And you don't just say, oh, well, that was ill-defined, so I'm not going to use the concept. Okay, so the other one would be the opposite. Very simple, very simple. Belief changes truth. Okay, so another way of saying this, or another way of establishing the concept in an objective manner where you try to maintain it and you try to build on the idea. So what we have is belief changes truth. This is where you draw a conclusion to begin with, and you cherry pick information that supports your belief, and you present that as the truth. Both available. Okay, for automation. Belief changes truth. It doesn't have to be an illegitimate way of thinking. It's definitely not an illegitimate way of thinking. It's top-down thinking. It happens all the time, and it's perfectly legitimate. The only thing is you have to be consistent and honest, and you have to integrate. But basically, you choose a goal that you want to achieve, and then you think, what are the means to that end, right? Okay, so in terms of a little bit of trying to produce some consistency between terminology when I'm describing these two things, if belief changes truth is determining the means from the ends, that would, under the umbrella of trying to use consistent terminology as you expand on the idea, that would force you to use that same terminology when you're trying to describe truth changes belief. So belief changes truth, that's where you determine the means by the selected ends. So that means that truth changes belief has to be determining the ends by utilizing the various means available to you. Okay, so in terms of truth changes belief in terms of means and ends. That would just be taking a bunch of means and constructing things with them. It's just like deduction. It's just like Euclid's elements. You have these axioms and you just start building lines and areas and bisections and all this stuff with them. And it's all built from a few means, right? So that would be like deduction. And you would be able to use that terminology and still be, I don't know if this is like metaphorically consistent or consistent in terms of corollary. I don't know. I'll figure that out later. Okay, so belief changes truth. That's where you select an end, and the end determines the means. So, and that happens all the time, and it's perfectly legitimate. The only thing you would have to do And, utilitarianism heavily based on this idea, but the repair of utilitarianism would just be to say that the means have to be good as well, right? So, I'm not going to look it up. Remember, this is mostly for me. Documenting my mind, and documenting my conceptual development. So, utilitarianism, the repair. Before the repair patch came out, utilitarianism said that basically the ends justified the means. So, you want to do the most amount of good for the most amount of people, but it doesn't matter how you achieve that end. It's basically something that the philosophy was completely ignorant of, and it was an exploitation that was available for exploiters, right? It was a weakness in the code. All right, that's my understanding of it. As accurate as it may or may not be, that is my understanding of it. So, the repair patch would just say, the means have to be good as well as the ends. Perfect, fine, whatever. Still, you'd have to move on and define good, but whatever. Easy to understand, repairs utilitarianism, good, great, move on. Okay, belief changes truth. Do I have anything else to say about that? I could definitely mention the bad ways of using that idea. Primarily what I defined it as first, where you already have a belief, right? This is going to be religious. All right, everybody calm down. I'm going to use religious people as an example. Sorry, religious people, but here we go. Belief changes truth. So, obviously, that's where you just bend over backwards to make observations of reality and, logical conclusions all work towards this end, which is, building a high rating of believability for God, right? You start from the belief in God as your end, right? You believe in God and you want other people to believe in God. Now, what means so that end determines what means, right? And but it is definitely not restricted to the religious people. That this happens politically. It happens in every walk of life. Just sometimes certain examples are easier to use, to understand, to be widely understood. So, my apologies if any offense, but the common idea is out there and usable, and sometimes facilitates understanding. Okay. So, not recognized consciously by society. Okay. The next note I wrote down was not recognized consciously by society for the most part. All right. I don't think that I spent enough time on the fact that these two ways of doing things are supposed to work harmoniously together. And I think you would want to do that before you moved on. Okay, so you have one being more important than the other, or more fundamental than the other. That's on one hand. And on the other hand, you have the opposite order of importance, opposite order of fundamentality. I must say, all respect due to the scientific method. But when you get into formal logic and you get into unanswerable questions and, just unanswerable questions, incomplete premises or whatever you want to call it, contradictions, things that are only resolved by a school of belief, or a school of thought, right? So, philosophy has the idea of schools of thought. Now, what is that? That means that some question was so unanswerable or difficult to answer. It was so difficult to answer that it created shards, that it created fractions, fragmentation, right? So on the question of whether or not we can prove that existence exists, no, you cannot prove that. You can go into it for a little while, or however adamant you are about your answer, you can go into it for a long time. But if you are honest with yourself and you're generous to the opposition in your mind, if you create the opposition in your mind and you're generous with its arguments and honest with yourself, you will find that you cannot prove that existence exists. And just extrapolate from that question or rather that question is just a representative example. So there's many more questions like that. Now, what happens when something is unanswerable? What happens when you just cannot answer a question? And I mean answer a question by proof, right? What happens in that situation? Now, there won't be any proof of my answer, right? We're necessarily talking about an area that has no proof. Now, side note, if you're already using the axiomatic hierarchy model of cognition, you've already made peace with this idea because the axiom is unproven. It's taken on faith, to use a bold word. No, not a bold word, but to use a dangerous word. Skipping past that. So, what happens when a question is unanswerable, right? I cannot prove it, and I won't make any attempt to prove it, but I'm going to say that what happens when a question is unanswerable is you have to choose what to believe, right? So when you're talking about does existence exist, and you can't answer the question, and you've given it your good old college try, and you just got nothing, ultimately it comes down to how are you going to act? Shakespeare, not do or do not, that's Yoda. Shakespeare, to be or not to be, that is the question. Maybe right now we should change the quote a little bit by saying to be or not to be, that is the choice. 'Cause what do you believe? Basically, belief is what happens, or belief is what comes in to save the day, right? And if you don't like the word belief because of how prone it is to reinterpretation into the word faith, eventually I would like to dispel that danger or highlight the danger so that you can tell how to use it correctly. But 1 second. Let's pause. Okay, so assuming I'm recording again. Had to let the cat in. Where was I? Okay. I had to draw attention to the fact that these two things are going to work harmoniously. Now, in normal life, I went into the religious example. No, I was way past that. Well, anyways, in normal life, I don't think it's very well recognized that these two things are basically explaining a lot of the dissension in the world. Schools of thought. Belief comes in to rescue the day. That's where I was. Okay, so you have an unanswerable question, and it's about something that's really important, like, what is good and evil, or, do I even exist? Existential crisis, right? Like, things that can drive you insane if you don't get an answer to them and if you take them seriously. The more that you consider the question to be actionably determinant, the more you consider it to determine what actions you take, and it's unanswerable, that's a rapid pathway to insanity. To speak like psychologically, again, I repeat, I have no credentials. I have no psychological, I have no credentials. I do not have a degree. This is me parsing ideas. This is me putting ideas into categories and lining everything up so it looks nice. Okay. I am not a doctor. Okay. So belief comes in to rescue the day when you have an unanswerable question. Yeah. And the more you think the question is super important to the way life is and stuff, and it's unanswerable, the more detrimental it is to be unable to answer it. So when you have an unanswerable question, belief comes in to rescue the day. And I have no proof for this, so I'm just going to assert it and be honest about my assertion, because I believe I'm speaking in an area where no proof is available. Because I do believe, and as supporting argumentation, I can say that there's a school of thought out there called the axiomatic hierarchy model of cognitive development or conception. And I can say, there's a school of thought out there, therefore, there's wide agreement. I could say that. And it's good for whatever. Maybe you should just set the school of thought on the side as separate from how many people believe in it, and just look at how it works, and just look at how it works in action, in your mind, in reality. All right, that's good, because now you can say that belief comes in to rescue the day. And then your unproven idea that there even is such a thing as an unanswerable question. What's the sound of one hand clapping? If a tree falls in the woods, does it make a sound? Blah, 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 blah. If you have an unanswerable question, you can grant this on a hypothetical level to be functional within the mind. All right, so you have this thing, an unanswerable question. Somehow it's proven that it's unanswerable. Not going to happen, but you have this unanswerable question. And then you make this claim, oh, right. So functionally speaking, mechanically speaking, what happens if you don't have belief come in and rescue the day, right? If all you have as a resource is proof, is decidable question, if all you have as a resource is decidable questions, like exaggerate the whole idea. Like imagine that you could not move until you resolved a question. Right? So like, what do you want for breakfast? Like, imagine that you literally cannot move to obtain breakfast until you have resolved the question in a provable manner what you want for breakfast today. Right? So imagine that. And functionally speaking, mechanically speaking, not necessarily 100% applicable to reality, but functionally speaking, mechanically speaking, what do you get by shoving in the idea that belief comes in to rescue the day when proof cannot answer a question, right? So the whole thing has this virtual desktop sort of plausibility or validity to it, right? So I'm saying that belief comes in, and I think that rescues the attempt from the hands of anybody who would want to disagree with me or cause counter-argument to happen. At least in my opinion, that answers, everybody's got their inner disagreeer with them. So at least in my mind, that bypasses my inner disagreeer. All right, so I am going to move on, and we are working under the assumption that belief comes in to rescue the day whenever truth can't answer a question. So the normal way of speaking, where truth changes belief, that's like normal life, What do you believe? Well, in response to your question, sir, I say what is true, because I believe what is true. And how do I determine truth? Well, I have evidence, I have proof, I have consistency. And great, that is good. That is the good way of doing things. That is the normal way of doing things. But what I'm trying to highlight here is that there is a flaw in it. There is a weakness in the code, in that way of doing things. And that comes, if not epistemologically speaking, then at least from the formal logic speaking. Philosophy and epistemology, traditionally, the way the words are used, the way I used epistemology makes it complex to speak about it sometimes. But philosophy and epistemology already have this brain-in-the-box idea, and, Descartes, I think, therefore I am, attempts to answer it. Zeno's paradox, you can't move. All kinds of just, wrenches thrown into the works to just make it, at times it seems like there's no such thing as truth, right? But these things happen. That's the point. These things really happen, and it'll happen to anybody who thinks about stuff. So, it helps that everything has been delineated to such a degree that you can refer to formal logic as being like a strong source of unanswerable questions. It helps to have that in place, but it also is necessary to remind myself that all of that stuff is just bifurcations or permutations or partitions of what the mind is capable of anyways. So, underneath all the structure in the different sciences that have been built on philosophy, underneath all of that is an actual mind that works in actual reality and is perfectly capable of being in a situation where a question is unanswerable. That's a real event that will happen, right? Okay. All right, so we have that, and we have it pictured in a functional mechanical way. We have this assertion that belief is more fundamental than truth. Normally speaking, what is true would define your beliefs. And then we have this other side of the coin, the dark side of the yin-yang symbol, if you like, where formal logic can produce all these unanswerable questions. And in that case, belief comes in to save the day. So in this way of thinking, in this side of the coin, where belief changes truth, that last part threw me off. Right, so belief comes in to rescue the day. On this side of the coin, shoot. The normal way of doing things is truth changes belief. Right? That's normal. That's good. That's the scientific method. That's observing reality and, determining what you believe. But then also there's the fact that, one second, kitty cat wants to come inside. Okay, cat successfully inside. Where was I? Okay, so the normal way of doing things is truth changes belief, and then every once in a while, every once in a great while, it's necessary to have the opposite order where belief changes truth. Which is a bit off-color way of speaking, but I'm trying to use consistent terminology when I consider both these sides of the coin. So it causes this awkwardness, but there's something to that effort that's necessary, conceptually speaking. When it comes to conceptual mechanics or epistemology, in my opinion, there's no standardized vocabulary for the science. In fact, I would say that the science barely even exists. But anyways, belief changes truth. When you're looking at the appropriate use of that term, where belief comes into basically when schools of thought are the solution to an unanswerable question. In terms of fundamentality, we have these two sides of the coin and their opposites. So you first imagine a separation between these two ways of doing things. Truth changes belief, and that would be that truth is more fundamental and truth is underneath belief, and that truth forms belief. That belief is formed from truth, right? That's one way of doing things. And then another way of doing things, often the wrong way, often the dangerous way, often the not to be trusted way, but still to have this small little area of applicability where it's proper to use it, of validity. Belief changes truth. Where belief is more fundamental than truth, where truth is created from belief. Even saying the words is difficult to get out because I'm so against the idea of taking that literally and actually using it as a way of being. Nevertheless, this does happen in real life. People do use this mode of thinking and action determination to live their lives, where truth is built up from beliefs. All right. So that's a good way of thinking about the two when you're thinking about the two as separate. Okay. Not recognized consciously by society for the most part. Yeah, I would say definitely not recognized consciously by society for the most part. When I was imagining that note, I was seeing how ubiquitous the idea was. I was seeing how fundamental the two ideas were and how many ramifications and or consequences how much of reality they explained, right? How much of arguing in society those two ideas explain. That was the big thing. And basically, it's unfortunate that a lot of arguing in society is made up of these two ways of doing things, but the people of the society and the people doing the arguing do not recognize, for the most part, that it's these two methods of doing things that are causing them to argue. And that very, very quick distraction, that sort of touches on the idea of free will. Okay, don't go down the road too far. Don't get distracted, but do mention free will. You have choice, you have degrees of freedom, you have options open to you. However, you are a living creature, and assuming that you think staying alive is a good thing, your actions are going to be towards that goal. So it makes it look like you are not free, right? You're a living creature and you want to stay that way, and that determines your behavior, so that makes it look like you're not free, whatever, that's fine. And then you get into the nitty gritty of it, and it's difficult to do away with free will because there's so many choices. There's so much thinking to do. Okay, good. Stop. Go back. What was my next note? For automation. Okay. So I had this idea about these two ways of doing things, about these two ways of believing, about these two ways of determining actions. And I saw how much of reality played out and was in accordance to one of these two things. And it seemed like a big, huge idea to me. But I'm also interested in the conceptual mechanics, even more so probably than capturing this idea. I'm more so concerned with, let's say, automating the conceptual process and discovering that vocabulary so that I can use conceptual mechanics more efficiently, so that I can get better at thinking, So I'm trying to, really study this field called conceptual mechanics, because of the promise of the field. If you're studying math and you're developing math and you're making contributions to mathematics, what you get out of that subject is more and better mathematics that can do more for you in your real life. That's exactly what I'm trying to do here with epistemology. I'm trying to learn about thinking so that I can get better at thinking. Okay. So that's why I start talking about automation. And I start talking... Okay, hold on. Yeah, so for automation, that was the first time that I saw these two ways of doing things, truth changes belief and belief changes truth. That was the first time that I saw these in terms of the way the mind processor, I saw the motherboard, If you could see me, my eyes were wide, right? Because I'm being exaggerative, but, I'm only half joking because it really did seem important to me at the time. It was really a eureka moment or a aha moment. On a scale of 1 to 10, I would say it was about a 6 on the aha moment level, just because the idea is so new. And when you first think of these things, they're probably bloated in importance. But anyways, so for automation. So then I saw what these two things were in terms of the motherboard and the circuitry, In my computer programming, I saw, this is super fundamental to the way, my hardware works or whatever. So I saw that real quick. So basically, I start going back and forth between developing the idea itself and then developing the conceptual mechanics field of study vocabulary that surrounds this conceptual realization. Okay, so I said automation because I have this anecdotal evidence for the process of, I don't know the words really, but I grew up in a snowy part of the world, and driving on the street was sometimes very dangerous, and sometimes your car will start to turn sideways when the roads are slippery. And there's something very unintuitive that you have to do when that happens. You have to turn into the curve. At first you want to correct and you want to steer in the opposite direction in which your car is turning, because you want to return the car to being straight. And reflexively, whatever it is, that integrator in your mind, that subconscious, emergency backup system that just takes over in emergency, that thing does not understand turning into the curve. It only understands return the car to straight line, steer against the curve. However, once you understand that doesn't work, and you correct your actions, and you turn into the curve, and your car automatically rights itself, almost seemingly magically, you learn that fact and you incorporate that fact, and lo and behold, over time, the new fact becomes the new automatic response. Whatever whatever you want to call the automatic response emergency backup system takeover that your mind performs sometimes, that reflexive packaged conceptual action nugget that gets played upon, whatever you want to call that, it's adaptable. You can change it. You can change what is automated. And automation is such a fundamental idea that mentioning that these two sides of this coin, these two ways of doing things, considering these two orders of fundamentality in terms of how you integrate information and how you determine actions, this is going to be huge. This is going to be huge for automation, and automation is already huge for behavior, for like really good, effective behavior. All right, moving on. Okay, so then going back to the idea itself, jumping out of epistemology itself, but going back to the idea itself, those two ideas are supposed to be working together harmoniously. They're supposed to work together in what you would call mutual benefit. And using the words mutual benefit is important to describe society, right? So we're realizing ramifications now. We're realizing consequences of an idea, right? So politically speaking, capitalism, communism, whatever, you're on a deserted island, and then you find somebody else lives on the deserted island too. Why do you guys interact? For mutual benefit, and whoever gets to determine what is mutual benefit, either the people in the interaction or the relationship themselves, or a powerful third party who gets to determine what is mutual benefit for them. Politically speaking, it has ramifications, but the whole idea is that this is a pathway into the, speaking loosely, neural compartment of, explaining relationships between people. All right, these two things, this whole truth changes belief and belief changes truth. Let's just focus on the right, and I explained how truth changes belief has a weakness, right? When it comes to formal logic, I rely heavily on formal logic to create these unanswerable questions for me, right? I'm resting on that. I'm relying on that. As this is where truth changes belief, or belief is created out of truth. This is the one little tiny area, but the all-important and pervasive area of weakness that, the scientific method has, or I guess you could say the axiomatic hierarchy has, because the assumption of truth, it's everything built up from the axioms is only as good and valid and accurate as the axioms themselves. Okay, so hypothetically grant the idea that truth changes belief has that weakness. Because the exact opposite is the case, where it's difficult to understand. Okay, so now flip the coin. Now we're looking at belief changes truth, or truth is created out of beliefs. It's the exact opposite, you know. This side is so wrong, is so bad. It's almost all completely bad, and everything built with it is just completely bad and wrong. However, there's that one little nugget of applicability where it's valid. Right? So we have the one side and we have the other side. Why are there two sides? Stop having two sides. Or rather, what would be more accurate to say would be, rather than maintain a separation between these two sides, rather than make these two sides fight each other, if you've analyzed them to the extent where you can conceive of the idea that each one has a weakness and that the other one plugs the weakness of the other one, now you get the idea that they're supposed to work together harmoniously within the mind. And then epistemologically speaking, you would say that this is what the mind does. You know, you try to be honest with yourself, but you also try to conceive of awesome goals. You want to achieve really awesome things and good things in life. You want to, so you imagine awesome things that you want to do, and you imagine what means achieve those ends. And then maybe you overshot a little bit, you know, maybe you're not going to be an astronaut, you know. So then the truth has to change what you believe. But you have to take those emotions with you. You know, you can't think that you've downgraded your goals. You're still doing what you're capable of. You're going as hard as you can. You're achieving as much as you possibly can. You may have overestimated what you can actually do. So that might be a little saddening if you don't remedy that idea. But you should be saying, as long as I'm doing the most that I can do safely, I should feel as though I am achieving an astronaut status in my mind. Because that's the only difference between the two, is either, you know, I'm able to do it or I'm not. Man, I don't know, that it applies to everything, but I don't have time to make all the connections. Very fundamental area. All right, anyways, they're supposed to work in mutual benefit, like society. They're supposed to be a feedback loop for the other. They're supposed to improve each other. All right, so truth changes belief, belief changes truth. You know what I didn't do? I didn't make a statement that incorporates them working together, which I probably should have done. But like I said, I sort of move fast and break things on this one. So truth changes belief, and it's the important thing is to imagine them as being held separate. As you know, to imagine that they will not work together, to imagine that they don't work together. You know, imagine that every time they get together they fight because they just won't accept the other one. Which is really unfortunate if you're on board with me saying that one plugs the whole of the other, right? You know, where one is strong in the exact shape and area of the weakness of the other one. That was a good way of saying that. So if you hold them apart, That's the thing. That's the thing about society, right? Because that's one of the things that makes me think that this idea is important, is because you have to look at how much debate and animosity and disagreement there is in society, and you're thinking while you're thinking about this, I understand the disagreement. I can see why the disagreement is happening, and I can fix it, right? That door is open to me because I can see this concept, and I can see uh, when like when you extract an idea from a situation, that's what you can do. I can see in the disagreement that the two sides are using these two methods, and they're not using the other one either. But anywho, um, next notes. Build off of one another, work together, harmonious relationship. Number one is like scientific method. That was the truth changes belief thing. And number two is like begging the question. And that was the belief changes truth thing. Okay. I think begging the question is a popular way of putting that. I think that cognitive bias is another way of putting that. Um, there's that one, I can't remember the name of it, but it's where you think you're smarter than you are. Uh, Whatever that one is, I think that's also a form of this one. You know, just to add fuel to the fire, that this idea is very fundamental and very applicable to, everything that we see happening around us, especially in the sense of society. And hopefully, maybe in the background, we can find an example of it happening in theoretical physics, right? If one hand washes the other, if each epistemological development uh, translates into something in another field of study, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that works out. Who knows? Next note. Moving on. Conceptual mechanics. Uh, what is the thing these two systems occupy? Uh, what place do they hold in the thought to action process? Thought to action process. Attempt at wording. How fundamental? Question mark. The whole process of absorbing observation of reality and turning it into a motility. Thought into action. Thought into action. Right. Okay. So that was just me, trying to find the words to say this idea, thought into action, that whole process. Um, that whole process, thought into action, that's a very, 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 very simple way of saying the whole process together. Uh, and then, jumping up or down, I don't know how you're supposed to look at it, but whatever way you look at it, in terms of detail or complexity, and then looking at this idea of truth changes belief, belief changes truth, hold these two ways of doing things as being separate, but then also consider them as working together and basically bring them together. I haven't really dwelt on the whole idea of calling them one thing, but that's probably where you would have to go. But, the concept is still in formation as I speak. So, uh, and so that last note was about me trying to word things well. And so thought into action is very fundamental. It's a very vague description, but it captures the whole idea. So since it does capture the whole idea, and this other thing that I'm talking about only captures part of the idea, maybe it captures the whole idea, but with more detail. That's the ideal. That's what you're going for. You want to capture the whole idea and go up in detail. That's really good stuff. Those are good discoveries when that happens. Multiplication came out of addition, right? Anyways, next note. If fundamental, create a caricature. Uh, uh, okay, what am I saying? Create a caricature. Oh, so to picture using these ideas, create a caricature. So create a person in your mind that truly only believes and consistently and ardently only believes in one of these two statements: truth changes belief, and or belief changes truth. You'll create those two characters, and they'll act only in accordance with those principles only. And just write that story, make those characters act in the world and see how real we're getting. Uh, Sever the symbiosis. I guess symbiosis was my attempt to picture them and put words to them being together, right? Because they're working together to create the good. So that's the third. The connection between them is like the third thing that I can't really put my finger on, and it's like my brain's totally back burner, because I'm conceptually developing this idea, and up front is the detail of what the ideas are, and then in back is how they act with each other, and then in the back of the back is actually trying to put words to the total integration of the idea or the total separation of the idea, putting words to the actual separation between the two ideas, and or putting words to the togetherness of the two ideas and including them as working together and including what they're working together to achieve, quote unquote, the good, including those three things together as one thing. That is definitely on the back burner of my understanding, but it's probably the next place to go, and is probably the more important, more ramified, consequential. A lot of consequences would come from doing that. But under construction as I speak. Next note: thought to action, hierarchical process. This means fundamentality. Having increased introspective knowledge of the process will help improve the process. Okay, so this is me talking about getting smarter. This is me talking about getting better at conceptual development, getting better at conceptual interaction, getting better at conceptual constructions, using that whole model of deduction to build things with, and then induction as well, taking a bunch of disintegrated concepts and asking myself what would integrate these things, right? That too. The whole thing, the whole thinking caboodle, right? So having increased introspective knowledge of the process will help improve the process. It will speed it up. Like, you'll have a checklist and you'll go by a checklist. Did I think about it this? Did I think about it this way? Did I think about it this way? Did I think about it this way? Did I make it do this? Did I put it into this situation? Did I put it into that situation? And I'll have a hierarchical or fundamentality priority list that tells me what situations are the most important to put it into and how that relates to every other part of the field. Anyways, it will help me be thorough. That's what I was just saying. It'll help me, quote unquote, think for myself, because I have this whole thing about thinking for yourself and how that's a really vague statement, but it doesn't have to be a vague statement. You can understand and be certain that you are thinking for yourself, because you don't have to make up things to think about. You don't have to be unique. Think about it like a murder investigation. Did you consider the evidence? Did you go where the money led? Uh, hopefully, hopefully, a homicide detective is not thinking, that the words "I have to think for myself" mean that I have to be unique from everybody else, right? Hopefully, a homicide detective is looking for evidence, considering the evidence, and going where the evidence leads. That is more applicable to real life and real thinking than just, the edgy sort of, rebellious, cheeky pop culture music sort of understanding of those words, think for yourself. It sounds like sometimes obviously be independent. Obviously, there's applicable interpretations of the words, but there's also not good interpretations of the words. So, like, if you're just being disagreeable because you want to be unique, then that's what's achieved. You're just being disagreeable person. Just that's it. That's what you are. Anyways, but think for yourself. I consider it to be for people, right? For the young people, because I remember being young. For the young people who have that saying, like, think for yourself. Don't be a cog in the machine, or don't be conformal, don't conform, don't be conformist, blah, 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 blah. For people who that thought is much more immediate, it would help to have that idea well defined, right? If you could say for certain, on this idea, I definitely thought for myself, because what is there to think about this idea? There's A, B, C, and D, and to my knowledge, there are no other things to think about, and I thought about all those things before I made up my mind on that idea. And since I thought about all those things, and there are no more things to think about, you cannot say that I did not think for myself, therefore I did think for myself. That's extremely valuable for the young, stupid, rebellious people, which I was once. It will create common understanding. Having increased introspective knowledge of the process will help improve the process. It will create common understanding. Yeah, sure. As long as there's like an agreed upon vocabulary for conceptual mechanics or epistemology, as long as there was an agreed upon vocabulary, then, and if this idea was, fundamental and important in the process of thinking, then yeah, sure, it would create common understanding. So anyways, next note, cap this documentation at, right? So I wanted this to be a quick, right, conceptual capture, but I do tend to ramble. Right, so even in my notes about this idea, I started telling myself to shut up. I started telling myself to cut it short. So cap this documentation at what to call each separately, what to call the separation itself, what to call them together, and of course I haven't, achieved these goals to any degree of satisfaction yet. But it's okay, because the idea is there in the mind and it's functional and it's going to happen because of that. Next note. How many interpretations are there? How much of experience and or conceptual landscape? Can the presence of these ideas be felt, extrapolated? And how much of experience and conceptual landscape can we see these ideas at work? Which is to say, how fundamental to the process are these ideas, right? So we can get an idea of fundamentality by looking at ideas that are less fundamental, like those more subjective things, like what t-shirt should I wear today? We can look at the more subjective area of thought and action, and on degrees of the spectrum. I'm not saying go totally subjective, because that would probably be totally subjective. But I'm looking at things that are not as fundamental. So if you have a loose description of what levels of fundamentality means, 1 through 10, how fundamental would you say this idea is, right? So we want to be looking at fundamentality levels of 5 to 10,
instead of looking at fundamentality levels 1 and 2. Because when we look at the fundamentality levels of 4, 5, 6, and 7 and 8, and if we can see this idea, that it's possible to extract this idea from all the concepts and ideas that are in those lesser fundamental levels, then that goes to support the idea that this idea is very fundamental. All right, that made enough sense. I'm satisfied with that. Okay, so next note. How much good can be done by seeing these ideas at work? Psychological health. Are these two things working together harmoniously? That's the mental health question, and then the assumption in the field would be that they should be working together harmoniously. Because in the field of psychology, you're talking about curing anxiety, you're talking about curing indecision, you're talking about curing insanity, you're talking about mental health, you're talking about, like thinking is good for you, like thinking makes life easier, thinking is the only way to make life easier, really quickly, again, repeating, I am not a psychologist. I have no credentials in the field, so I'm basically going by the general idea of the things. Psychology should deal with mental health. Mental means thinking. So epistemology is going to come into play in the field of psychology. Right? So these should be non-contentious things. But, always, always recognize I have no credentials in the field. That's fine. Okay, next note. It implies a vast amount of degraded performance. Okay. So we're thinking psychology, we're thinking mental health, and we're thinking about these two ways of doing things as being separate and causing degradation in mental health, right? Because in the end of this documentation, in the end of this recording, in the end of this writing, my note taking about the idea, I'm trying to see what the value of the idea is. I'm trying to recount what the value of the idea is. So, yeah. So these two ideas within the field of psychology would recognize that a vast amount of degraded mental performance, I should say, may be explained and repaired and identified by root cause as belonging to two very simple to understand concepts. The ramifications for mental health are what make it feel very important. Next note, the hint of its fundamentality or ubiquitousness make it feel very important. And that was the end of my notes. Yeah. Psychologically speaking, one of my favorite things that I said during this recording was, to the extent that reason can play a part in repairing mental health, this whole idea basically categorizes degradations to mental health into two categories. For better or worse, however accurate you think the idea is, once upon a time, I saw it as being very accurate, and that made me think that it was very important to record this thought. And that was the motivation for it. And also for my own thinking, I think that I am going to use this idea myself. And spoken long enough. Goodbye.